So I want to talk to you today about platforms built on top of platforms and why that's going to matter for mobile AR. I've been thinking a lot about AR and what it means right now. We've heard a lot about AR in the future, and I think there's some amazing things happening at this present moment. So to lead off, it was mentioned, but so I co-founded VR AR at MIT, which is MIT's VR AR community. We have several wonderful members from that community here today. And in that process, one of the things that I found that I was being asked the most from our community members was my opinion about, where is the space going? And sometimes I could pontificate about 5, 7, 10 years, but for a lot of developers who are working on projects right now, they really wanted to know where things are going to be 6, 12, and 18 months. And so that's where I focus for you today. And so first I'm going to talk to you about basically what a mobile platform is, and I want to talk to you about some past strategies that are going to shed light on some important strategic maneuvers that determine who wins and who doesn't. So to begin with, platform businesses are huge today. If you look at the biggest tech companies coming out of the US or in the world, most of them have gotten where they've gotten because they've pursued a platform strategy. Well, what does it mean to be a platform or even a mobile platform? So first off, you're connecting essentially different groups. You could be connecting two different sets of users. You could be connecting users and third-party developers. You could be connecting users or advertisers. Doing this well means you win big. And the reason that you win bigger is as follows. So firstly, you leverage network effects. And I know this is like, for anyone who's read about this feels like I'm beating a dead horse, but bear with me. The important thing here is that what network effects mean is that the more users from perhaps one side that go on the platform, the more valuable it becomes for both of them. In multi-sided networks, for example, the more third-party developers that enter the network, the more useful it becomes for the users. The more users that then become on, the better it becomes for the third-party developers, and so forth. And so this creates a reinforcing cycle where the product becomes better and better, stickier and stickier, and therefore more difficult to compete with. And then building on top of network effects, we see that ecosystems sustain the winners. What I mean is that when you take multiple products that work even better together, and this could be other pieces of software, it could be platforms underneath it, it could be the hardware that works best with that piece of software, it again makes it even more difficult to compete with these winners. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of historical examples that illustrate how these things work together, and then I'm going to take you through what this all means for augmented reality. So as it stands today, here's the mobile stack, right? We know we have mobile hardware, we know we have operating systems, and we know we have wonderful apps such as Hot Dog or Not Hot Dog, that's clearly taking the world by storm, and the lesser known Facebook, Google search, what have you. But the question is, how did we get into this hyper-competitive space where companies like Google, Apple, and Facebook seem to be eating everyone's lunch? So first I want to talk about Apple. So what Apple did is Apple understood the importance of an ecosystem right off the bat, right? They launched the iPhone, hardware, OS, and app all together with a sort of very not so robust app ecosystem built out. And then they expanded horizontally, right? And they expanded services, and the more that they expanded, the tougher and tougher it became to want to change products, right? Because it just all works so well together. Google did it a little bit differently. Google started with software, right? They started with the killer app of the late 90s and early 2000s, which was search. And then from search, Google expanded horizontally. And they built more and more services until you just wanted to use everything from Google and make your day-to-day happen. And then once you were hooked on Google products, they expanded downward, right? And in the late 2000s, they made Android a thing. And then after that, which we've seen, now the Pixel is a thing. And so Google expanded down the stack. And the point is, once again, that once you get locked into Google products, it's hard to break that addiction. Facebook's an interesting company to look at because they've just expanded outward, right? Still a platform in its own right, connects users and advertisers. Facebook started with Facebook as we knew it and then began to expand outward horizontally in the software layer. And of course, they layered on things like Messenger, they bought WhatsApp, they bought Instagram, they included video, and they even experimented with paper, thinking that maybe you wanted to read the news separately. And then lastly, I want to get your attention on Snapchat. So Snapchat just has an app. It hasn't expanded horizontally very much yet. It mostly just does the same thing that it did in the beginning with some new features. And then Snapchat made a huge jump to hardware, right? And they released Spectacles, and they basically sort of indicated, maybe we want to be a little bit like Apple. If we release this piece of hardware that really augments, I know, fun choice of word, the functionality of this, then maybe people are going to want to continue using Snapchat over everything else. So now I want to talk to you. We've learned these strategies. We've seen that sometimes companies expand horizontally. Sometimes they work up the vertical chain between software and hardware. But why does any of this matter? Well, it matters because the first thing you do when you open your phone tends to be opening up one certain type of software, right? Maybe it's iOS. Maybe it's Android. Maybe you jump straight into Facebook. And where you stay is big business. And we're going to talk more about why that is. So we saw at Facebook's most recent conference that mobile AR camera might be the next frontier. Facebook and their competitors are dreaming of the world where the first thing you do when you open your phone is you look in your camera. And then through your camera, suddenly you may have new apps or functionality that you use to layer augmented objects or information on top of the world. And if what you're doing is staying in that camera, then anyone else who gets boxed out of that, for example, a non-visual search, a non-visual social app, might be terrified. So they're already starting to talk about how they want to go and win the space. There's a lot at stake in this war. So first is data, right? If you lock people into your platform, if everyone's accessing the camera through your platform, then you're learning everything that's going on about them. And perhaps one of the most valuable pieces of information that you learn is what people are looking at. And as you might imagine, what people are looking at tells you an enormous amount about them. So for example, if I look at Bill right now, you might tell that I think he's the man, and I think he's really smart, and then maybe you might target some sort of ad based on that, which means that a lot of dollars are at stake. Because with that extra data, not only can you build better products, but you can build better monetization strategies for those products. And this is entirely how Facebook and Google came to own 80% of the online ad market and make billions and billions of dollars on top of it. And then lastly, from a strategic consideration, the third D in 3D, again, think about augmented reality, is domination. And this is the idea that when you have people locked in your platform, you're leveraging network effects, and you have them locked into your ecosystem, suddenly you have the power to execute your vision and execute your strategy. You're not necessarily being reactive anymore. You're able to be proactive in trying to continue to serve your users and build your products better and wider. But if you have to be reactive, if people are sniping at your feet and starting to compete for attention, suddenly you may have to break your strategy, and that's where we see product quality start to crumble. And so for the mobile camera, 4 distinct strategies have emerged. And this is literally within the last few months. We're seeing the big players already start to maneuver around each other to try and make their camera platform the platform that you go into in order to access AR functionality. So first we start with Google, right? And so what Google's basically doing is they're unleashing Lens and Tango. They want to expand horizontally. They want to start with visual search, a killer app just like for regular search how many years ago, and then they want to get third-party developers to begin to help them expand that ecosystem by using carrots like Tango and the Tango SDK to get people building AR applications on top of Android. So in essence, they want to leverage their current position and do what they did all over again. Facebook, for now, maybe they want to live on top of what Google or Apple's OS. And what Facebook wants to do is they want to take their killer app and make it even more killer, right? They want to start with their compelling social app. They want to attract third parties by offering up their social data as the carrot. And now here's where it gets interesting for Facebook, right? Maybe you think that Facebook is dreaming of a world where, again, you just click into Facebook's app and you open up a camera much like you do with Snapchat. But Facebook demonstrated their rollout of Oculus Home and their partnership with Samsung that they're already thinking about burrowing even further underneath with the platform, right? And so Facebook has demonstrated an appetite to maybe expand to an OS. So now there might be a world in the not so near future where Facebook isn't just building on top of what Google and Apple have. They're directly competing with them. And again, if the first thing you do when you open Android is open Facebook, what's the point of Android anymore? There we go. And then lastly, well not lastly, but second to lastly, we look at Snapchat, which I think it's kind of been vogue lately to dismiss what Snapchat is doing. I think it's super interesting because Snapchat is starting with the lenses, right? This is like honing in on their core product, and then they jump to the spectacles. And this, I think, foreshadows what I describe as sort of like a reverse Apple, right? So when it came with Apple, they basically said, we want to do full stack, everything at once. I think what Snapchat's doing is trying to reverse engineer that process. They had a really disruptive social app, and now they're trying to think, how can we take this and begin to roll it further down the stack? Someday, maybe, could we see people putting on our spectacles, and the only piece of software they want to access on it is Snapchat, and then upon that lies everything else. And so yes, like Facebook is eating their lunch a little bit and copy what they're doing now, but I think Snapchat is thinking way bigger than just their lenses for what their platform may look like. And finally, I want to talk about Apple. This was my original slide for Apple. You see, I had sent in my slides for this a week ahead of time, and yesterday I was sitting on my couch feeling really good about myself because I got everything done. And then I was listening to the developer conference in the background, and then I realized I had to change my presentation, and I was pissed off. But what came out of that, obviously, was Apple talking about the AR kit. And this actually resembles quite a bit of what Google's doing. So let's just say that what Apple is trying to do is kind of expand horizontally on what they already got. They imagine you opening up your iPhone as it is. They want to entice third-party developers to build out the ecosystem, and they've built a fundamental SDK to make that really, really, really easy to do. And so lastly, there's the so what of this, which is who's going to win and why do you care? And to have that conversation, I want to first start with a story. So I think history can teach us a lot about what happens next. I started working on this and studying this as part of a class on platform strategy at MIT with Professor Andre Hague, previously of Harvard, now at MIT. And one of the things we talked about in that class was that much of what we think is happening for the first time now, in some version has happened before. And what we focused on was thinking about the original OS versus browser war in the 90s. And if you think about Microsoft's position in the early to mid 90s, right, you would think like Microsoft was, they could have their cake and eat it too. Most computers that people were using had Microsoft's OS on it. But then what Microsoft realized was that Netscape was starting to grow. And they were starting to think, well, what could the world eventually look like? And they realized that maybe there's a world 5, 10, 15 years down the road where people aren't necessarily going to be buying CD-ROMs to access all their software. They might just be able to navigate in their web browser and access everything through the browser. And I'm sure Bill Gates may have been sitting at home one night, in his beautiful home in Seattle, and it suddenly realized, like, holy crap, that could mean that Netscape literally would have out-platformed us on our own platform, and users would just access Netscape first thing in Windows, and we wouldn't matter anymore. And so Microsoft went full force, and in a couple of years went from 10% market share in Internet Explorer to 90% market share, right? And what they did was they leveraged their vertical position. They basically said, well, we own the OS, so people that go into Windows, we can just nudge them to use our platform on top of this, and we win. Now, antitrust cases aside, this actually was pretty successful. In a couple of years, they basically tipped the market, and it seemed like, okay, Microsoft should own the browser for the rest of the time. Think about that. Microsoft should own the browser for the rest of time, right? Apple and Google should own the OS for the rest of time. And then something really weird happened. 10 years later, the market share of IE started to erode, and erode, and erode. And suddenly you look at where browsers are today, and while it's a bit of a plurality, Chrome is far and away the most successful browser. And you ask yourself, well, that doesn't make any sense because Windows is still the most popular desktop platform. They should have continued to win. But what happened was Google strategically realized something. They realized that their horizontal position, having a series of apps and pieces of functionality that enhance one another, could create a very serious nudge in and of itself to use their new piece of functionality, which was the browser, which you could use to access all of it. And so by having Gmail and Maps work better with the browser, everyone reached the logical conclusion that this is what we should have, and they downloaded Chrome. Very interesting. So maybe the status quo won't remain the status quo. And so I'll end with this, which is my thinking about what matters and who's going to determine the winner. So we already talked about the positional, which is basically how far down are you on the stack. We talked about the killer app, which is do you have something really compelling to start with that you can command horizontally. Speed may be important, right? How much does the first mover advantage matter? And then lastly, design. To what degree can you basically put your finger on a, for lack of a better word, zeitgeisty development where you essentially realize a cultural development before it happens and then are able to ride the mass hysteria that surrounds that cultural development as it happens, right? Like Snapchat realized very early that this was how people are going to want to capture content. They designed around that, and that enabled them to grow very, very quickly. And so from a positional advantage, we've already established Google and Apple have the big leg up. From the killer app advantage, search and what Facebook has, which is either standard Facebook or Instagram, are far and away still the most popular social apps out there. And they're often two of the first things you do when you open mobile. From a speed perspective, it gets interesting. So I actually think that Snapchat has the biggest advantage here, right? They basically showed that they could stay ahead of the game and develop the most compelling social application for the camera before anyone else can. Now, Facebook and Google have an interesting and compelling way to compete with that, acquisitions. They have a ton of money, and it allows them to sort of grab the rope really quickly and try and catch up. But they still don't beat Snapchat to the punch. And so if Snapchat can catch a wave before they can, again, there's a real possible wave of serious growth that they can use to win. And then lastly is design. And here I think is where Snapchat and Apple have both demonstrated a real strength compared to the others. Snapchat we already talked about. Apple, like Steve Jobs, have we heard of him? Like, we get that this whole design thing is a real central part of their identity. And so the question is, if Apple continues to build something not necessarily first, but in a better designed fashion than its competitors, then maybe it wins this. Who wins? I'm not going to claim to be like a Swami and understand the future here, but here's why I think this matters for you. Because there are a lot of developers and there are a lot of technologists in the room who are already thinking, well, how do I build AR applications that are relevant and popular now? And while the cost of building for the wrong platform has decreased over time, it's still significant. And if you make your bet on building for Facebook, and Facebook loses, and the time it takes you to port well over to the other platform, someone may be able to come and eat your lunch. So I would say, think about this framework for yourself. Ask yourself, who's going to win? Do you think it's going to be the status quo? Do you think Snapchat's going to ride a cultural wave? Or do you think Apple's going to come in as the second mover here and just do it better than anyone else was? And make your bet accordingly. But don't just ride the wave. Don't just read TechCrunch or Recode one day and do whatever you think is happening. Because I promise you, these factors have mattered before. They're going to matter again. And maybe we're going to live in a future where things don't look quite a bit like they do right now. So thank you very much.